I own a car, but ride my bike whenever I can. Depending on the traffic, it might even be faster than driving. Or maybe I just like feeling the wind on my face. It rarely snows where I live, although it can get pretty hot in the summer. Sometimes I arrive at work a little sweaty. Whatever. I like the exercise. Not too long ago, I noticed something weird. A man would stand on the corner of my street and watched me turn onto it. He looked to be in his mid-30s and had bright red hair. His head turned as I passed him, but he never said anything. One evening, I walked back up the street after parking my bike to see him, but he was gone. I knocked on the door of the house on the corner. An elderly woman answered. I asked her if she had seen a man loitering on the corner outside of her house. She said she had. He's there every Sunday through Thursday, she said. Never on Friday or Saturday? I asked. She shook her head. Are you sure? I'm home a lot, she said. But you've never asked him why he's there? No. Have you? I shook my head. Thanks. Thank you. I won't take up any more of your time. I was about to leave when she spoke again. If you see him anywhere else, let me know. I told her I would and got off of her doorstep. There was no doubt that the man was watching me. I work Sunday through Thursday. Did she know something about this man that I didn't? He wore large glasses and polo shirts. Were it not for his hair, he would have no trouble blending in with the crowd. The sun was setting by the time I got back to my house. My roommate was still at work. He had lived with me for a month or two now and worked different hours than I did. When he got home, I would tell him to watch out for the man who stood on the corner. At the moment, I had nothing but a suspicion that something was wrong, and I've learned to trust my suspicions. I started to cook dinner when I heard a scratching on my roof. Small animals routinely climb onto my roof, so this wasn't unusual in and of itself. But the scratching persisted. It sounded like something was trying to carve a hole in the roof with its claws. I opened my back door and stepped out into the tiny yard. From where I stood, I could just see a squirrel's tail. It had bright red fur. I'd never seen that color of a squirrel before. It stopped scratching and looked at me. We locked eyes for a second. I swore that it recognized me. The squirrel bolted out of sight. It was running across the roof to the front of the house. I sprinted into my kitchen and through my house. The pot on the stove was boiling, but I didn't care. I flung open my front door and ran outside, still in my socks. The squirrel had landed in front of my house and stood on the sidewalk, staring down a big black dog that stood in the street near the curb. The dog was not wearing a collar, and I didn't recognize the breed, but it had patches of gray in its fur, very similar to the pattern in the old woman's hair. The squirrel was frozen in place. There was a tree a few yards away, but the dog was just a few feet closer. The squirrel ran for the tree. It was mere inches away from the trunk when the dog caught it in its jaws. It squeezed tight and shook its head violently, and the squirrel went limp. Its head was hanging from its neck by a few strands of flesh. The dog let it fall from its mouth and stared at me. It jerked its head at my front door. If you're telling me to go back inside, then forget it, I said. The dog bared its teeth. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't just let the matter drop. Are you going to eat it? I said, pointing to the squirrel. The dog shook its head. Bury it? The dog looked at the squirrel and back at me. If dogs had eyebrows, I swear it would have raised one. I want to know what's going on here. The dog turned around and faced the street. It didn't start walking, but instead turned its head to look at me. I believe it was asking me to follow. Okay, one moment. I have to put my shoes on. I did so and walked back outside, and the dog was still waiting for me. Okay, let's go. The dog turned to the left. We weren't going to the old lady's house. The dog moved at a brisk pace, forcing me to jog to keep up. There is a park down the street from where I live. Just a paved path flanked by trees that leads to a field. The dog led me to it and down the path. The trees on either side were dense, but not so dense that I couldn't still see the houses on either side. I was about to ask the dog what was so special about this place when it stopped and it pointed to the trees overhead with its snout. When I looked up, I saw that the trees were full of birds. Blue jays and robins and other birds I usually see only very early in the morning. They were all up now and staring at me. One of the birds flew down and landed on my shoulder. Another did the same. More landed on me until my arms, shoulders, and head were covered in them. I wanted to shake them off, but I heard footsteps behind me. The birds took off and landed back in the trees. My roommate Harrison had followed us here. He was a few years younger than me, just out of college. He had sandy blonde hair and angular features. We faced each other. "You left the stove on," he said. "Oh, sorry." "I'm sorry about what happened with the squirrel. That guy's been following me for a long time. I spotted him, so I think he started following you instead. Maybe he thought he could get to me through you." What did he want?" I asked. "He could turn himself into a squirrel, but that wasn't enough. He wanted me to show him something better. I told him to get lost." "What can you do?" Before my eyes, Harrison's body split into a dozen smaller forms. Each of them had feathers and a beak. About a dozen birds flew out of his clothes, through the trees and into the sky. I saw them form a V shape before disappearing in the direction of our house. The dog barked as they flew off, possibly as a goodbye. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I wondered if they were ever going to come back. And then I saw the birds returning from the direction they had left in. They landed and poked their heads inside the empty pile of Harrison's clothes. A few seconds later, he stood before me again. Human. "So, you're a birdman," I said. "You're taking this very well." "I've had a lot of weird roommates." I noticed he was patting his stomach. "What did you do?" "Well, we had to get rid of the body. I'm not leaving it to rot like roadkill." I stared at him a moment. Whatever species of bird he had just transformed into. I'm pretty sure it did not eat squirrels. I looked back at the dog. It showed no apparent emotion. "I'm gonna go back home. I'll just make dinner and watch something." "Go ahead. I'll be out for a walk." I knew that he liked to take walks, except that it sounded like they weren't exactly walks. Without another word, I passed him and walked back up the street to our house. If anyone in the neighboring houses had seen what just happened, they probably didn't believe it. Then again, you never know. The squirrel's body had gone. Not even its bones remained. I pushed that out of my mind and re-entered the house. After a few minutes standing in the empty living room, I removed my shoes and went to the kitchen to prepare mac and cheese. When he was human, Harrison was a good roommate. The lady down the street didn't seem so bad either. I noticed that they didn't tell me how they got their shape-shifting abilities. Harrison didn't get back until late that night. Strangely enough, I feel like we understand each other better now.